Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwayne McFarland.
All across the fantasy universe, welcome in. It is the Fantasy Football Hustle, powered by Pro Football Focus. Wait a minute. What did I just say? The
Powered
Fantasy
by Pro Football
Hustle,
Focus, man. Come on.
Powered by PFF. So that is right, folks. We are under the umbrella now of our good friends over at Pro Football Focus. You know that Dwayne did a lot of great work over there last year. And now you're going to get the hustle promoted by Chris Collinsworth and all the guys on Sunday Night Football. All right, maybe not all that, but, you know, it's a great partnership for the show, and we're very, very happy to be under the wing of PFF. So I am Brian Drake of FightingChanceFantasy.com, joined as always by PFF and ETR's Dwayne McFarland. How are you, my friend? What's going on down there in Texas?
Man, I'm good. But like the best acronym tonight, is the RSP. Like forget PFF and ETR. We love it, but it's the RSP, man. We got Matt Waldman on. Like, you know, it's time for football when you have Matt Waldman on. Like,
exactly.
Like what else gets your juices going more to where you're like, you know what? I just have to start thinking about football. Then when you get the RSP on April 1st, it's not April Fool's. You actually get to open it up. It's just like Christmas for me. And I know all my buddies, as soon as my buddies saw that you tweeted out, Drake, that he was going to be on the show, literally my text messages, I could show them, they start flooding of everybody like with all their questions for Waldman. They're like, ask him this, ask him this, ask him this. I'm like, okay, calm down. Like, we'll see what all we can get to. Like, get in the chat room, people. Come on.
4 years ago, when we started this little endeavor as just two guys in our basement, which pretty much every podcast is, our first ever guest on The Hustle was Matt Waldman. So it is only appropriate that as we launch this new venture, we bring in the man, the myth, the legend, the author of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. It is Matt Waldman. You read his great work over at mattwaldmanrsp.com. That's where you download the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. Also is a senior analyst at footballguys.com. Matt, welcome into the hustle, man. Glad to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations for the affiliation with PFF. That's awesome. And I'm, honored to get to be able to do the first show with you guys ever, and the first one as part of the PFF sponsorship. So that's very cool.
Absolutely. And
yeah, I think before Matt, we had like 4 people. So Tonight, I think we'll hit quite a bit more than that. Tonight, there'll be the 3 of us and like 7 more. But
yeah, I mean, my family is watching, so I think we'll at least be at 10. So they'll be okay at that point.
If it gets pretty boring, Matt has a saxophone behind him. So we'll just see if we can play us a couple of tunes. I don't know. Roger Hornsby or something out here.
But there you go.
So, folks, if you're listening to us in April and you're downloading the RSP, it must be time for fantasy football. And fantasy football means you need to get over to PFF. And now, guess what? We're really big time. We've got a promo code. You can now use promo code HUSTLE for 25% off any PFF subscription and access to all of PFF's fantasy football rankings, their locked articles, and data you can't get anywhere else. They even gave me access to this. And I was on there earlier today scrolling around. If I want to find out just insane information that, some dork like me up here in New York never thought possible, folks, you can get lost in this site just like the RSP. Smart football fans want to combine these two things. We've got Mike Renner's draft coverage. Our good friend of the show, Ian Hartitz, has his best ball talk. And, some guy named Dwayne McFarland does this thing called the utilization report. That's up there every week during the NFL season. Also, don't forget that PFF is hosting a live draft show on PFF.com April 29th to May 1st. You're going to get coverage of every round, live reaction from analysts like Chris Collinsworth, their team of other analysts, including guests like Richard Sherman, Al Michaels, and more. Who knows? Maybe Dwayne will show up on there. You never know. Tune into PFF.com.
They should.
Yeah. First round on April 29th. So with all the pleasantries out of the way, this was a crazy, crazy year, Matt. We had no combine, which I was never a huge combine fan. We had teams playing limited games. We had guys like Jamar Chase just completely opting out. So with all this craziness going on with COVID, how did this impact your research and your process for the RSP?
Well, I was pretty blessed this year, to be honest, because all this craziness could have really impacted it in an adverse way. But it turned out that I had more access to tape than ever. And I had the opportunity to watch a lot of coaches' film, probably more than I have at any point in my career. But the oddest thing about all of this was probably just the uncertainty of everything from week to week, month to month, not knowing what you might come up and what you might have to deal with. And then after that, certainly the lack of a combine in the pro days is a big deal, because whether you are solely studying analytics of the player and not watching film, or you're watching film and looking at the analytics, then you want to be able to understand what the workouts can give you an indication of in terms of their athletic ability, because it's not always going to be as easy to tell how fast a guy is, how quick, how explosive they are, just watching film alone. There's clues, but it's not always that simple. And then what happens, though, is because you don't have a singular testing place, now you have all this home cooking going on. And this home cooking ranges from, if people think of that as the scout. Oh, well, it's going to be LSU's crew that's going to be fast with the stopwatch, or they've got some weird thing rigged up. That's the fan kind of letting their imagination run wild. What it really is that maybe the playing surface has more elasticity and bounce. So, players have a little bit more, explosion in terms of adding maybe an inch or two to their vertical leap, or just the ability, or that the surface is kind of cut lower so it's easier to run. You get a little bit, just get those tenths of a second faster. That can make all the difference between someone who might be at a starter tier or a reserve tier in terms of those timings. So those things can be a little bit more difficult, because you look at those times and you wonder, you're like, someone joked on Twitter a couple weeks ago, you get a 4.3 and you get a 4.3 and you get a 4.3, like it's Oprah handing out gifts, but then at the same time, you see guys who certainly it was befitting of what I've seen on film where they were not earning that, like Tamorian Terry, a wide receiver. You watch his game and people go, well, all he does is catch touchdowns and he gets deep. And I'm like, yeah. And until he faces a top cornerback who looks like he's, a top elite speedster cornerback who he can't get separation against. And then when you look at his 40 time versus his 20 shuttle, you realize he needs a big runway to be able to build up to that top speed. And, top cornerbacks aren't going to give it to him. And you can see when he has like a 4.7 20 shuttle, which is like pretty awful, for what you're looking for from a deep receiver. So that's kind of the complexity of it that made it a little bit harder.
So this week we did have a little bit of news break, and it was centering around the Jets. They traded away Sam Darnold to Carolina. So we wanted to ask you not only about Zack Wilson, who is the presumed number 2 pick to the Jets, but also Darnold. We want to know how these two prospects compare in your eyes. And if one of the great things, folks, if you go to the RSP, and I know it's one of Dwayne's favorite things, is Matt will do how many years ago back? 3-year comparison, 3 years on classes. So you can see how maybe a Travis Etienne compared to a Jonathan Taylor and things like that. And so we just missed that with Sam Darnold. So I'd love to get you to tell us Darnold versus Zack Wilson and what you think Wilson could bring to the table.
Well, if we were going to say that they were both coming out at the same time, I'd much prefer Sam Darnold. Now, that doesn't mean that Zack Wilson isn't capable of becoming a starter. It's just that you have to understand that I'm not a singular team grading with my specific offense and coaching staff and scheme fit, to determine who's the best possible fit for me or who are the candidates. But if I'm looking at what quarterbacks can do and how well they do it, Sam Darnold has a greater breadth of potential and greater depth of potential than Zack Wilson. But now, of course, we've had a few years of Sam Darnold. One of them was a mono-shortened year, and the others were with the quarterback screamer, Adam Gase, who's basically screamed, Ryan Tannehill out of Miami, and probably gets a lot of credit for what happened with Peyton Manning. But I think Peyton Manning, we all know, has been the head coach of 2 offenses during his career, or at least the offensive coordinator in that sense. I know some guys who played with Manning in Indianapolis, and they would tell you to a man that if Peyton Manning said stop the tape when they had a team viewing session, he would do that. The room would go silent, and he would explain what he preferred and what needed to be done. Even if he overheard another position coach saying, you did that wrong, he'd stop and review the tape and go, no, actually, you did that the way we want you to do it. And then the young player would turn and look at his coach, and the coach would say, if Peyton told you to do it, then do it. I've literally been told that story by a former running back, with the Colts and a number of other teams, talking about the differences between that. So when you look at, this team, Sam Darnold gets a new shot. Mm-hmm. Is he in a situation where he could possibly succeed and get a new opportunity to grow? Absolutely. How likely is that to happen? Well, we haven't seen it very often, to be honest, not in the recent era, our generation of NFL. We probably haven't seen it all that often for that to be the case. And when it does, they usually get to sit behind a superstar for, 2, 3, 5 years. And when I say usually, we're talking about one or two players, namely one like Steve Young. So it's not all that common. The odds, if you're playing the odds, Sam Darnold probably isn't going to be the answer. But if you're looking at what he's done on the field, what he's capable of doing, and what he could provide with a team that possibly has a better coaching staff and better leadership than what the Jets had when Darnold was there, then you want to give him a chance. When you look at Zack Wilson, listen, to me, the only fit for an offense for him in the NFL to be an NFL starter is a wide zone scheme, much like what we saw with San Francisco, Minnesota, and Cleveland. And Cleveland's a really good example because, Baker Mayfield is a guy that I think he compares very much to as a player. And, Baker Mayfield got some really high-end comparisons as, the next Drew Brees, Russell Wilson, Brett Favre, whoever you were, that was, many people who were on that kind of train. I didn't think he was all that accurate relative to the way stats are recorded and the way that they break that down. And I think I've been proven correct thus far when you look at the level of his accuracy with his game and some of the problems that he's had. To me, he compared more to the best of what we saw of Jeff Garcia, which was a Pro Bowl player, but he needed a lot of help around him to be able to achieve that. And Baker Mayfield is that kind of player where the Cleveland Browns put enough around him where the opportunities are simpler. And I think with Zack Wilson, you look at him and the play action pass is a strength of his. He can throw the back shoulder fades, which are nice, but you don't live and die by those passes. You need to be able to be accurate in the middle of the field. You need to be able to make good decisions and not throw hospital balls to your receivers, which is something he has a problem with. You need to be able to understand leverage against coverage that you're throwing across the field and not have it jumped. And he's gotten away with a lot of those. You have some mechanical issues with his front leg where it creates inaccuracy issues, both sailing and sinking, depending on the distance of the throw in terms of where he's throwing it. So there's a lot of little things with his game that, with him being able to be put in a position where he can play action, roll out, have options where receivers are working across the field, which gives you more open windows to be able to hit a receiver and more opportunities to be able to make a good decision. That's what we saw with Josh Allen last year. When you have these levels concepts where you have, receivers working across, they get open faster, and they have, as opposed to say like a comeback route or a post pattern, you have these routes that give you 3, 4, 5 windows of opportunity to hit that receiver. And that's why I think Josh Allen, who's improved a lot, but ultimately too is in a system that really plays to his success to buy time. And I think you see the same thing with Baker Mayfield. You see the same thing with Zack Wilson if they can't get rid of the ball quickly. And so this could help him be a viable NFL starter. But to me, in a world where if we were in an ideal world about quarterback development, most of these guys, as good as they can be to even have nice offenses put around them early that will help them be successful year one. Most of them, I think, would be best to sit a year. And Zack Wilson, I think, would be in the best situation to sit for a year. But it's not going to happen. So if he survives this year, the reason is that he's in an offense that is really best suited to what he can do. And really the only thing that I think he would do NFL level in terms of fit.
Hey, man, and just in your opinion, why do you think it is a guy like Wilson has shot so far up boards, right? This time last year, like a lot of people didn't even know who Zack Wilson was, and then he makes this huge leap, likely to be the second pick. I mean, so it sounds like he's definitely got some limitations, but what do you think it is that people, see in him that really do create that excitement?
There's really two fundamental things. The first fundamental thing is that there's a lot of variation in how we scout players, and you can be a former NFL quarterback and scout players, but if we don't know what your process is, we don't know what you value. You could value athletic ability to the extent that it's almost an error that you're valuing it too much, or you could be valuing arm strength to a point that you're outweighing things like how well they read coverage, whether they make right decisions, whether they have any type of mechanical flaws that need to be corrected, or whether they put players at risk. We don't know what their criteria is. And so when you have that kind of variation in terms of what people value, I mean, you go to watch the NFL 100 and you look at I think 9 out of every 10 players, you ask them what impresses them about the player ranked 51st on the list or 42nd on the list. And all they're talking about is he's so fast. He's so quick. He's so strong. He's so big. And it's like, that's most of the stuff. And it's like, and then they'll ask the all pro or they'll ask the pros pro. And it's that one guy out of 10 who's like, the way he moves his hips with this particular technique, when we set up here, he just reads what we do so well. He has 5 different techniques that he can use to get past that guy. Or he has an understanding of concept so well that he can read the body position of another defender. And it's just, we don't know what he's doing from one thing to the next because his technique's so good. And so that's part of the problem, is that there's a wide range that even if the guy has incredible credentials as a player, it doesn't mean that he knows jack about actually studying the position. It may mean that he does. JT O'Sullivan knows a ton about studying quarterback play and has obviously put in the work and has criteria. There are other guys out there that I would look at and go, I just don't really know what you look at. Doesn't mean that, and so there's part of that. So when you have a big stage and you talk about things that you value, they may be, maybe a point where certain things are over exaggerated in terms of or given too much weight. The other thing is that the NFL has a little bit of a level of hubris to it. And it happens all the time. They see a player have success that they didn't think would be successful because they feared that he was going to be too aggressive, too reckless, didn't have the out of the box kind of robo quarterback type of technique and look about him, didn't play in a traditional offense that you're looking for because they have these prototypes that are strict in place. And they see Patrick Mahomes have success beyond their wildest imagination. And they go, oh, well, and you see it from the mouthpieces and a lot of people who are kind of mouthpieces for NFL teams. They'll go on podcasts on national outlets and say, well, if Patrick Mahomes wound up in Cleveland or in Buffalo, he wouldn't be the same player. Well, of course he wouldn't be the same player, but he'd still be unbelievably talented and be more talented than the players that wound up there. I mean, and it's so the idea that he was, but they want to say that it was the teams that developed the player who had these intrinsic talents, that Deshaun Watson, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, that all of it was the brilliant development plan of these teams. Meanwhile,
let me actually ask you something on that, Matt. I think you're hitting on a great thing. So it's like I think about the stock market, right? You could go and you could pick a stock that has all the perfect fundamentals, all the perfect, technicals, But if you're trying to buy into a market that doesn't allow growth, so if it's not like a bull market, you're still going to fail. And that's the kind of way I'm looking at quarterbacks right now in the NFL, that there's probably been guys that have come along that could have done some of the same things that we're seeing from some of these other guys. But they're just, at the time, there wasn't a flexibility, right, in the league to say, oh, you know what, we're going to actually adapt and really do, what this player can do best. And we can really make that work, right, within the confines of an offense that may look different than the one we have today. What are your thoughts on that? Because you got guys like Michael Vick, you got guys like Vince Young, who ended up, doing some things in the league. But, I mean, there's an argument that maybe they could have done a lot more. And that's just a couple. The list could go on and on and on of guys that probably could have had a better chance to succeed in the league. And part of it does go back to what you were just talking about with athleticism. Teams are looking for ways to get their quarterbacks more involved in the running game, right? Just because of the problems it creates from a numbers standpoint for the defense. What are your thoughts around that and what we're seeing in the league? And then lastly, like, you can probably just transition that, since we're probably running along on quarterback, and what does that maybe mean for a guy or two that you're excited about, in this class, and how they might be able to unlock some things for some teams?
Sure. I mean, right off the bat, you could say Charlie Ward never got a chance. And Charlie Ward would have been excellent probably in a spread system. And if he had the opportunity, my favorite quarterback, just as a fan, is Steve McNair. And if you look at what he did in a Heimerdinger offense, where they spread the field and let him like run empty, and he was the MVP of the league that year. But otherwise, he was in and basically might as well have been, he was in that high school offense that Todd Gurley complained about under Jeff Fisher for all those years. And he didn't have Randy Moss. Imagine if they had actually drafted Randy Moss when they could have, instead of Kevin Dyson. Steve McNair, I would argue, would have been a Hall of Fame quarterback with multiple Super Bowls, probably, if he had that player, because he was an unbelievable talent. But when you play conservative football, or John Elway, and look at what he did at the end of his career, imagine what he would have done during his career in a spread system. Andrew Luck would have looked like a rank amateur, at that time. So there are players like that even in the distant past, that you could give some examples of what would happen, if they had more opportunities, not just guys who, there were other issues with, in addition, that you mentioned, who were talents to certain degrees. But that's the thing. I think that's what's wrong with the NFL, is that they actually think by drafting Jordan Love, Drew Lock, and Zack Wilson, that there are some people who literally think, oh, they're Patrick Mahomes. They just need the right coaching staff and scheme, and we'll get it out of them. And it's like, you don't understand what separates Patrick Mahomes from those guys. You're literally looking too much at surface level things. And so I don't think scouts do that, but I do think the decision makers over scouts do that. And they see the buzz, they see the big market conversations, they see the ticket sales, and they think, well, let's make it happen. That's why I've got all these guys. And they're looking too broad from a 30,000-foot view and not understanding enough of the details in this instance to listen to what their employees are trying to tell them. But guys who I think could really succeed, listen, I'm a big Trey Lance fan because he reminds me of Steve McNair. And when you watch him play, he has all the, like McNair, he has all the drop skills, the play action skills, the ability to run with power and speed, but he also has fantastic moments of placement as a thrower. That's something that you often hear them say, oh, well, his accuracy is spotty. Well, I've seen that, but it's different spotty accuracy than Zack Wilson. So you'll see a guy who actually, his throws are him trying to make the type of precision throws that Wilson hasn't even kind of gotten, hasn't even tried, or hasn't even been whiffed at, taken a whiff at in any way. So, he and, I like him. And then when you look at a guy like Fields, when you look at Justin Fields, this is a guy also that I think has as much upside as anybody in this class. He maybe has a little bit more downside because the variability of outcome in terms of certain things that you can say he turns on and off a bit with his game. But I think he'll be in a situation where put him in the right offense, allow him to run early, just like Josh Allen was allowed to run early, even if they would prefer him go to that third or fourth read in certain instances. I think that, like Allen, Fields and Allen can both process decently, but there's those 3 to 5 plays a game that defenses put you in a corner with, and the bad quarterbacks tend to only be able to make 1 or 2 of those plays. Average quarterbacks 2 to 3, and the best quarterbacks tend to win games because they can make plays on 3 to 5 of those pivotal plays that happen where the defense pins them in a corner to say, I don't think you can do this. Work your way out. And I think that Fields is a guy that can eventually do 3 to 4 things. But right now, you might want to lean on his legs a little bit more until he can get acclimated. And I think teams are going to do that.
The voice you're hearing there is Matt Waldman. He is the author of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. And if you're listening to this podcast, you can tell the level of research that Matt has done on these guys. And full disclosure, I stole this directly from your website, mattwaldmanrsp.com. The Rookie Scouting Portfolio is a process rooted in best practices. The evaluation techniques for the RSP are designed to target a player's athletic skills, positional techniques, and a conceptual understanding of the game. Folks, if you can't get that from just hearing the passion and the depth of information that Matt has here, boy, oh boy, I don't know what to tell you. And we're going to move on here to a guy who is a freak of nature, and that's Kyle Pitts. From his film to his workouts to just look at the damn guy. But, Matt, we all know that tight ends are historically very slow to produce in the NFL. So I want to kind of pick your brain as someone who's evaluated players for a number of years. And what are you seeing in his skill set? How can he be utilized, maybe not just as a tight end, so that as a rookie in fantasy football, he's actually going to produce?
His position is pass catcher. And I think that's really the simplest way to put it, is he's a pass catcher with a long radius, with enough speed to stretch the field, with the ability to use his speed in a way where he just baits linebackers pretty much on a regular basis. And so he's going to be used in mismatch situations. Whether you want to call him a bigger Kenny Golladay, or you want to call him a Jimmy Graham, or you want to say that he's potentially TJ Hawkinson with a little bit more to learn as an inline blocker, or the future Travis Kelce. Those are things that you can apply to him in a variety of ways, depending on which way you want him to grow. So it depends on how the team decides to use him. If a team decides that we want him to be the next Kelce or Hawkinson, then he's going to have to develop a little bit more as a blocker, and he may struggle a little bit more because his head's swimming with that kind of information to develop. And that means that he might be overthinking some plays as a route runner and pass catcher, because he's got a lot that's on his plate, because it's a demanding position where he's good, but he's not great. He has moments where you're like, where he's heading. But if you've been doing this for a while, but you may be able to catch an impatient fantasy GM off guard, and who's, disappointed by a 2-drop or 3-drop game or some sort of thing that's uncharacteristic of him, and they're like, oh, he's a bust, and you might be able to take advantage of him. But for the most part, I think most teams will look at him and say, we'll let him develop his blocking over the period of time, but we're going to use him mainly as a detached slot receiver, an outside guy, and use him for mismatches, just like they use Golladay on the inside a lot, matched against safeties, or sometimes even linebackers. They got the opportunity to put him on, and you'll see some deep plays out of him. So I think more like Jeremy Shockey, Jimmy Graham early on in their careers, where you saw they had some quality games, but they necessarily weren't starters right away. I still think you should probably play the odds in that regard and say, I'm not counting on him to start year one and be a top 12, top 15 fantasy starter. But I think that you take him knowing that by year 2, he will probably be that. He would have been my number 3 wide receiver in this class if he's picked as a wide receiver. So really, that's why I think you take the chance on him. You probably even take a chance on him late in redraft leagues and deeper leagues, because he has that ability that they may just decide, you know what, we're going to use him more as a receiver on the outside. And if you do, and if you know that he lands on a team like that, the chances go up that you're looking at him more as a receiver who might be labeled a tight end, as opposed to a tight end who plays receiver.
So, Matt, if you're sitting in a dynasty draft, because we know, some people will be drafting pretty quick, right? Some of these leagues draft before the NFL draft even happened. Some happened shortly after. I mean, just hearing what you were saying about Pitts there, like if he was a receiver, he would have been your third receiver. Like, where do you kind of stack him? Let's just say it's a rookie draft just this year, not a Devy, but you've got this rookie class, and say all things are equal, typical like PPR kind of setup. Like, where are you anxious to take Pitts at? What spot are you not letting him get past? And I know roster construction and there's other things that definitely matter, but I also know that you're super high on just getting if you can get really good talent up top, then that's what you want to do.
Probably somewhere between 3 and 5. If he falls to me at 3, I don't know how I'd be thinking to myself, I probably got to take him. I mean, like, especially in a PPR format, because to me, great tight ends are anchors. When you can have a Travis Kelce for 4 or 5 years delivering wide receiver 1 production for you, and not even 1.5 PPR, that's still an advantage in a lot of respects. So yeah, if he would not fall below 5 for me, but there might be instances where I'd look at 3 or 4 and say, I might want another player, but it's probably doubtful.
Yeah, I have to say, when I first read the RSP, and not to give away too much, but just how high your grade was on Pitts, which I knew, a lot of people loved him. Well, you and I had a phone conversation. I think he was the first guy. Like, we talked about saxophone and guitars, and then we finally got to football. Like, Kyle Pitts, I think, was the first name out of my mouth because I wanted to know. And I immediately asked you because I know how much you love TJ Hawkinson. I was like, all right, so if I got Hawkinson already, how do you feel about Pitts? And like, when you told me that you had him, slightly graded above Hawkinson, that's when I knew, wow, Matt really, really loves him. And then, when I saw your peer group that he could potentially start to fit in, on the RSP, like that, like sent me over the ledge. So I'm probably going to be trying to trade up.
Yeah. Like Hawkinson to me is the better all around player. But the thing is that when you score a guy, sometimes, the depth of their talent carries more weight. And this guy is, when you have a wide receiver, you have a primary wide receiver in a tight end's body, and he already at this point just needs to learn a little bit. He's good enough blocker if he had more weight to him, and even now, I mean, he's bigger. He's as big as Irv Smith probably at this point, and all he does is tend to try to overextend a little bit against bigger defenders. So as a result, he's not always going to have optimal looks against defenders in the NFL, but you're not going to be sticking him at the line all that often on primary assignments if you're a wise NFL team. And I think there's enough wise NFL teams that we can play the odds and expect him to be pretty awesome.
Now, if you're a dynasty owner and you don't get your hands on Kyle Pitts, can you give our listeners maybe a name or two of some other tight ends that might be available that, everyone's just talking Pitts, so these guys get completely overlooked? Who else could be a difference maker for fantasy at this tight end class?
Well, I think this guy is probably the safest play, but it's Pat Freiermuth out of Penn State, who a lot of people, the Penn Staters, describe him as Rob Gronkowski. People who've watched him on Twitter joke around that he's Rob Slowkowski because he's not exactly the fleetest of foot, but he can stretch a seam. He's got quickness. He's a fantastic blocker and one of the better blockers I've seen. Like, he and TJ Hawkinson are probably 2 of the better blockers I've seen in the past 5 years. Him and Howard, I'd say Freiermuth, Howard, and Hawkinson are the best 3 that I've seen in the past 5 years. And he's a nasty good blocker with a lot of versatility in how you could use him. Sure-handed. A lot of people, the Football Guys podcast, I think Bloom and Cecil likened him to Heath Miller, and I like that comp. I think, Heath Miller wasn't a great fantasy option other than 1 year. He had a top 12 season, I believe, as a dump-off option. But it just depends on where he's placed. He could be in an offense where he'll be a red zone option. He'll be a contested catch option. He can stretch the seam, and he runs after the catch very well. He's just not fast. He's quick. He's sturdy, mobile. Tommy Tremble is a very popular name among draftniks out of Notre Dame. He's kind of an H-back type at 245 pounds. Decent quickness, catches the ball, really physical. He could turn out to be a nice H-back for a team down the line in 2 to 3 years. Brevin Jordan is very much like Irv Smith in the sense that he's an accomplished blocker, but can he grow? Can he get bigger? He might be maxed out at his size, which is kind of Irv Smith's size, and He's got good burst. He can catch the ball up the seam very well, runs tough after the catch. But his dimensions, you look at him and you go, is he ever going to be a full-time player? We talk about Smith getting his chance this year, but if Smith doesn't come through this year or next, you might be looking at Brevin Jordan going, I wish I didn't buy into him if I wasn't sure about Smith. So I love what I see from Brevin Jordan, but that's my minor concern about the state of the tight end position is, did we get a little too fancy with looking at some of these tight ends who might as well be the second coming of James Casey. And if you remember James Casey with the Houston Texans, he was a terrific athlete who flashed a lot when you saw moments of him running wheel routes and getting open against linebackers, but he never quite got the role that dictated production. And I'm a little concerned about that with guys who are in that same kind of height weight range. Was Casey before his time, or is it, or are these guys special enough to be able to do the gig? So I'd still recommend them, but if you've been wondering that, what I mentioned without me ever mentioning it, he's not the guy you're going to want to take them. If you're one of those folks who wondered that. And then I'd say probably after that, a guy named Sean Meyer out of Iowa, who he and Hunter Long can be workman-like options that might give you top 12 seasons down the line. Trey McKitty's another one who's got good burst. Noah Gray, if he's in the right system out of Duke, is a 4-5 player, but he's a James Casey-sized H-back, so I don't think he's going to grow. He looks like a maxed out wide receiver right now, but very good route runner, very good hands. Those are some of the guys that come to mind.
So we know from reading the RSP that you love a certain running back, and shout out to our good friend of the show. Follow him on Twitter at 5yardlee, because he, spoiler alert, is on our YouTube thumbnail if you're searching this on YouTube. And again, please subscribe, like, comment on the show. We would really appreciate it. But the TV networks aren't really talking about this guy. And we don't want to give away your ranking right now, Matt, but let's just say nobody's higher on the list than Ohio State's Trey Sermon. So this is the guy who just ran the 4th fastest 10-yard split in 8 years. So why do you love this guy so much, and what do you see him being at the next level?
Well, the film matches the data. When you take a look at the data, he's, if you look at like RAS data, which is kind of like a composite of all the different workouts, he scores a 9 out of 10, which is basically pretty darn high. And when you look at his tape, whether it's at Oklahoma or Ohio State, what you see is a back who understands he's integrated what he sees on the field and how to see it correctly with how to take correct action, which is meaning that his feet and his eyes are linked in a way where he can make a variety of cuts, changes of direction in a highly efficient manner that gets him yardage. And the efficiency is what's important, because guys get fantasy guys in general, and I used to be this way. It's easy to, when you're first starting out to evaluate players, you see jump cuts and people go gaga for jump cuts and speed, like dynamic movement. I want to see guys who have the Reggie Bush type of movement, or, the Saquon Barkley type of movement. And they just go nuts over that because it's so obvious that this guy oozes athletic talent. But what they don't understand is that for every Saquon Barkley, there's like 5 Anthony McFarlands who do the same exact thing in terms of their speed, their quickness, their ability to jump cut, but they have no idea how to use those skills to make efficient plays. And so, like, you can go to the rookie scouting portfolio site at mattwaldmanrsp.com and watch a tape analysis called "What Would Frank Gore Do?" And it's basically showing an Anthony McFarland run where he loses yardage. And then I'm literally talking through this because I thought, I wonder what Frank Gore would do. And I pulled up tape of a game, and literally the first damn play that I watched was Frank Gore running the exact play, and the exact and similar situation happened, and he gained over 10 yards on the play. And it was because he was efficient. And I'm talking old Frank Gore. I'm not looking back. I'm talking about New York Jets Frank Gore against the Chargers last year.
He's always been old Frank Gore.
Exactly. So after he tore those 2 knees, he was a different player. So at Miami. But that's the point, is that that great athletic ability is a nice baseline, but really it's not going to work out for you if you don't know how to use it. And when you look at Trey Sermon, he knows how to use his athletic ability. He understands how to run different schemes. He's a better pass receiver than people expect. There's too much of we didn't see him catch a lot of passes, therefore he's not a good receiver or it's less known, as opposed to looking at the quality of the receptions that he has had. And there are a lot of people that, just don't get to watch as much tape to be able to see that. But he has that to his game. So you got the power, you've got the footwork, the quickness, the speed, the vision in terms of the decision-making. He has the curvy linear movement, which I like, which is a ability to bend around obstacles. So he's got even an added level of skill in his footwork that Dalvin Cook has, that makes him a guy that can work around defenders at full speed in a way that's just extremely impressive. And the reason people don't like him as much is he transferred from Oklahoma, so therefore he lost the starting job. Well, no, he just was going to be sharing it with Ramondre Stevenson and Kennedy Brooks. And I'll be talking about Kennedy Brooks probably at a pretty high level this time next year. And when you have an opportunity to go to Ohio State, where they have Master Teague, and that's basically it for a national championship caliber team, yeah, if you're Trey Sermon, you'd go there. That's like a no-brainer. So I think that when you look at this guy, and it's funny, I was on a show earlier today with Rick Saratel's Draft Bible at SI, and when I told him that Trey Sermon was my top-ranked back, and has been that for a while, he said, it's funny. He goes, I talked to some scouts, and there's a number of scouts who've told me that they think Trey Sermon will be the best back out of this class in 2 to 3, 4 years. Like that, they would not be shocked one bit if that happened.
Matt, just to put it in perspective, and you can choose how much you want to give away here, but one of the things I do love, and Brian mentioned it earlier in the show, that I think super actionable, especially for dynasty folks, where you can come in and, you do these ranking all sorts of ways, right? You show the grades, and you've done a good job of talking about depth, right, of talent versus breadth, like how many things can they do? How good are they at the things they do? Which I think is super awesome. And you've already talked about your process. When you talk about Trey Sermon, like just think of some of the guys over the last couple of years, like I knew you liked him because we had chatted about him. And then when I opened the RSP and I saw like where you had him ranked versus some of these guys that I know you really did like over the last few years, like a Josh Jacobs, just tell people, kind of where you fit, even Jonathan Taylor, like where Trey Sermon fits in that conversation for you, just based on, the tape and the grades that you gave him.
Yeah. And that's the key thing, because if all things were equal, and that's how I'm grading, if all things were equal and you put Trey Sermon in Oakland, Las Vegas, or put him in Indianapolis, or put him in Baltimore, and made him the lead back, I think he would be as good or better than any of those guys who are in that class, because his breadth of talent is as strong as anybody's that I've looked at in recent years, and his depth of talent is just as high up there. I would say that guys who were higher than him or close to higher than him were Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Todd Gurley. I think those were guys. He's slightly below Josh Dobbins for me, who I had rated as my number one back last year. And he's on par with guys like Jonathan Taylor, Taylor and Jacobs. He's certainly on par with them. And to me, you can look at the number grade on my thing and say, well, which one's higher or lower? But really, it's also about the tier. And if they're in the same tier, it's like a pick 'em. It's like, what do you prefer? What are you looking for your offense? If I have Mac Jones and if I have Mac Jones 3, but I have Justin Fields 4, but they're in the same grade tier and it's a point separating them, it's like, really don't sweat it. Pick the guy you want. Now, if I have, Trevor Lawrence a tier above those two guys, then yes, I'm clearly recommending Trevor Lawrence over those two guys.
So with running backs, one other thing, that like you've really helped me out with over the years, Jay Moyer's also helped me out with it.
Oh yeah.
It's just it really does matter for a lot of these guys, like what kind of scheme they they land in, right? And it's not that they can't adapt and that they can't learn and they may not be able to overcome, but we don't really have any level of certainty. It's not like we can say 70% of the time, when a back that comes from a pure gap scheme can adapt to a zone scheme. Like, it's not that clean, right? And plus teams run all sorts of different concepts now, right? They may run gap type plays 30%, and they may run, something else 20% and something else 30%. So, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of nuance to what's going on, but help the listeners just understand a little bit about what are you looking for to whenever you look at a back that you think can truly do both. What's the difference between somebody that can run well in gap versus zone, and what makes the runner that can do both? And if you want to name a couple guys that you think can pretty much fit in any scheme, I think that'd be a good way to kind of wrap that.
Sure. So the first thing you're looking for is, when I refer to that eyes-feet combination, that's really about, you kind of need to understand a little bit the difference between gap and zone. And with zone, it's kind of like, zone for me is like multiple choice test. There's like A, B, there's options A, B, and C. And with gap, it's basically fill in the blank, and everything's geared towards one answer, and the blocking set up that way. Now, there are some opportunities to bounce or cut back on gap, but they're rare and not always recommended. You have to really be sure that you're doing that you can be fast enough to get through that. So the difference is with those two is that with a zone scheme, you really have to understand how to pace your footwork and how to press creases, get tight to a blocker so that you manipulate defenders at the second level or on blockers in front of you to move in the direction that you're going, so that you can then cut back or bounce to a different direction. And you're doing that as a plan to set up one of those three options. Whereas with a gap play, you're just trying to set up that one crease, and you may vary your pace a little bit here and there, but you don't need as much in terms of lateral agility as a gap runner. You don't need a lot of lateral agility. You're best when you have really great burst, top speed, and momentum generated power. So like a guy like Tevin Coleman's a good gap runner because he's not particularly powerful, but if he gets up to top speed, he's like a missile. And so you can, you get some good skill out of him that way. But a guy like Devonta Freeman in his past, this is a guy that could make 3 jump cuts in a row, make 2 defenders miss in the backfield, find the backside crease, and get 15 yards. And you might say, well, that's not as impressive as the 30-yard run that Coleman just had. But if you look at what Coleman had to do to get his 30 yards versus what Freeman had to do to get his 15, you would appreciate Freeman's more than what Coleman had to do. And so it's one of those situations that, bigger backs with good burst can be guys who are good gap runners. Smaller or bigger guys who aren't extremely fast, but have good short area change of direction quickness and have precise feet. You don't want guys, when they make cuts, they're not making wild cuts. They make cuts that are as wide as they need to be or as deep as they need to be. And they're not wasting a lot of space when they change direction, because they understand, how to get tight to their blocks, but also how to change direction as needed. So there's that's kind of the difference between the two schemes and the types of backs. Nick Chubb can do both. I would say that you look at a player like Ezekiel Elliott, he could do both. You look at and then a player who can only do one. I would say that Kenyon Drake was a guy who could only do one for a while. Tevin Coleman has developed into a competent wide zone runner, which is the easiest transition from gap to zone. But that's still not his best thing, even though that's what he ran at Indiana. But, running, just because you run a zone scheme in college doesn't necessarily make you a good zone runner. It just may mean that you're a heck of an athlete, and that when you play the Ohio States of the world and gain 185 yards, that Indiana's willing to let him run it 20 times and know that he's going to get 150 of those yards on 3 carries.
So I would be remiss if I didn't mention you're doing something really cool this year with backs. I'm the data guy, and so Matt and I, we've had all these conversations. I've probably just about made Matt's ears bleed with requests around data that I wish that he had or that he was tracking, and a lot of it he has been. But I know, man, and I'm not taking credit. This is stuff that you've come up with.
No, but I appreciate you. I've got much love for you, Dwayne, and the work that we did together. So please.
Well, man, going. No, yeah. What you're doing right now with what you're tracking around backs, why don't you just give the listeners, so if you buy the RSP, the thing I love with it is you're constantly iterating, you're constantly trying to improve it, you're constantly taking in feedback, and just trying to figure out how to make it the best product there is, right? And to really, do the best job that you can, and just continuing to fine tune the process. And so one of the things that you're doing this year is you've brought in a new couple of data concepts with running backs. I know some of this even got out on Twitter a while back, where you were kind of going back and forth with Josh Hermsmeyer and sharing some stuff with him that you had been doing about what you think's really important with running backs, right, around contact balance, right, and being able to run through contact. Just tell folks a little bit about what you're doing with that and why you think that's so important.
Yeah, because over the years, I had made a comment once about how if you can't win indirect contact, or at least stalemate against a linebacker, meaning that if you collide head on with a guy, that you're not knocked backwards. If you get knocked backwards against a linebacker, based on, I don't remember what I told Josh, but I think it was, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was something like I looked at over 700 running backs over this period of time, and every running back who failed that metric didn't at least have like a stalemate against direct contact against a defender. None of them had a career worth speaking to, with the exception of two players. And I don't remember one of them, but the other one was Marlon Mack. So, you just look at the data there. There's a lot of backs that I graded, and I defined what these things are. So that, and then I was looking at, I cited the heck out of Nick Chubb because I liked him so much that I wanted to avoid the idea that I was biased with him, because I knew, as much as me not being a University of Georgia fan, I was working at the University of Georgia, and people would associate that. And I was saying that he was better than Saquon Barkley, who I liked a lot as a back, one of my highest scoring backs. But one of the things that just drove me nuts is you'd hear all this data points about Saquon Barkley gets so many yards after contact. And I'd look, and it's like, well, yeah, if someone slaps my thigh pad like that as I'm running past and I get a 60-yard gain, I should not be getting credit for 60 yards after contact. Like, to me, that's not meaningful contact. That's not that's not how contact should be defined. So I define contact. So what I've done is define contact by wraps, reaches, and hits. And you can have combinations of all three, really. You can have a hit and a wrap. But really, those three basic things. Reaches are the easiest because they're the easiest thing to break. Then you have wraps, and then you have hits. And I grade that not only by whether a running back has faced a reach, a wrap, or a hit, but also who's delivering it, whether it's a defensive back, a linebacker, or a defensive tackle. Because obviously, taking a hit from a safety is probably easier to bounce off than taking a hit from Aaron Donald. So you're gonna you want to differentiate and contextualize those things. So that's what I've done, is when I've watched backs, I've literally graded whether or not they dealt with a reach, a wrap, or a hit, and whether they broke it, or at least stalemated the hits. And so I basically graded that for backs and shown a percentage of and number of hits. And while the numbers aren't always high, because I may watch 8 to 10 games of a running back, and for instance, Trey Sermon's a good example of a guy who scored as well as like Javonte Williams, who was a high scorer in a lot of these categories. But Javonte Williams also had hits bounced off defensive tackles. Well, Trey Sermon had no hits bounced off the defensive tackles, but he had no hits from defensive tackles either, meaning that he was able to avoid getting hit whatsoever and didn't encounter the situations, which could be part offensive line. But considering who Ohio State's played, I would argue, and from what I've seen on film, it's more because Trey Sermon is very good at reading blocks and reading penetration and not getting into those situations in the first place.
Now, if you folks go over to pff.com and you use our promo code HUSTLE, you're going to get a discount on a PFF subscription. It's 25%. That's nothing to sneeze at, because you're not only getting NFL and fantasy content, but they have college info and they have player rankings. You guys always hear about these PFF grades, and Matt's not the only guy doing grades out there. The number one running back graded for 2020 on our board was Javonte Williams. And he's a guy, Matt, that you recently said was the safest running back in the class. Now, this kid out of North Carolina can run any scheme, and he seems like a great compliment. That seems like a great compliment for any incoming rookie. So what more can you tell us about Javonte Williams?
I mean, you're just looking at a guy who's built low to the ground. He's in that wheelhouse of what you're looking for physically. He has good footwork, excellent contact balance in terms of, play strength. Not only can he drag people and carry defenders on his back for extra yards, but he is going to run through contact. And he has a good feel of some of those micro movements that Jay Moyer and I both have talked about a lot in separate ways, and both on the RSP side about something that they share with guys like Ezekiel Elliott or Marshawn Lynch, which is the ability to make small moves to basically defeat angles of defenders or maximize contact angles that they make so that they are the aggressor and winning the leverage point of contact. And so a guy like Javonte Williams is very good at that. He's a good receiver. He's a competent blocker who can get better. He's just got a good all-around game. I don't know if I'm buying some of his workout numbers completely, but because when I saw him, I think he's fast enough. He has enough acceleration, but I don't think it's special. But I don't think it needs to be special for him to be at least a lead back or a co-lead in a committee who's going to be give you fantasy value as a starter or co-starter for, at least, 4 to 6 years if he can stay healthy.
So we've gone all this time, but we haven't even mentioned the strength of this class, Matt, which is wide receiver. And we all know about Jamar and Devonta and Jalen. But who are these next guys who are going to be drafted later in round 1, early round 2, 3, who we know are going to be impact players in fantasy for years to come?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot. Terrace Marshall is a good example of a player that will probably get drafted a little bit later, who can play the slot, who can also work on the outside. I think that he's a very compelling option. You can also add a guy like Kadarius Toney, who gives you a lot of that Golden Tate vibe. If he can just kind of he's a little bit of a wild child with how he runs, where his feet are a little bit wider than his frame at times as both a route runner and a ball carrier, and it can cause him to slip or get in awkward positions where he could get hurt. But I like how he tracks the ball, love his speed, love his after the catch ability. He's going to be an asset for a team that uses him like Tate. I don't see how they wouldn't. Mm-hmm. Other guys that fit the bill for me right off the bat, listen, Tylan Wallace, I think he'll probably go in the 3rd round. I think if he goes later, it's because teams went way overboard about his ACL injury. It's a guy who was probably, at least one of the data sources I looked at, he was one of the 2 to 3 fastest receivers before his injury in the past couple years in terms of just looking at his top end speed run during a game. And when you look at his ability to win the ball, he's a tough, physical, good route runner who plays bigger than his size. And I think that he's going to be an asset to a team. And one of my favorite players who I think will get picked may fall a little bit because he got COVID. He got the flu, and he lost about 20 pounds and looked like a completely different receiver when he came back without any additional training. And that was Rashad Bateman. When you watch Rashad Bateman in 2019, he's one of the 3 best receivers in this class. And I have him ranked as one of the 3 best receivers in this class because I think he's going to gain the weight back. And I think any team that looks at him is going to understand that he's going to gain it back. He's a fantastic route runner. He reminds me of kind of a mix of, if you look at the 210-pound version of Rashad Bateman, if that's what he was, you would probably say he's closer to a Keenan Allen, Michael Thomas-like player with Cordero Patterson's ability to run after the catch. Maybe not as good as Cordero, but pretty darn good, better than Thomas and Allen. And those guys are no slouches. If you look at the 190-pound version that he was, then you'd say, well, maybe he's a rung down from CeeDee Lamb, and still that's not bad but I think he'll probably end up getting his weight back to 210 eventually. And he'll end up being that type of player who can win over the middle. He has great catch radius and has enough speed and after catch skill that you can use him inside, outside. And I think he's a very underrated player. And I think those are all guys that I would look to in no later than early round 4, and probably being taken off the board in rounds 2 and 3.
Yeah, Bateman is a guy that I feel like he's probably going to go in the early second round or later in first round, just because like the analytics dynasty crowd, which, you know, they have some pretty smart takes. Like, they're really high on Bateman because he broke out at age 19. You know, he dominated market share on his team at a young age. He continued to do it. So, I mean, he hits a lot of the metrics. And then to your point, you know, Matt, I think people are onto the fact that he did play, you know, after being ill. And then he came out and did really well in his pro day, 36 vert, 123 broad, 4.39 40. So I don't know that everybody expected him to be able to move, that fast. So I expect to see him rise. One guy that I think it's kind of tough, Matt, I don't know really what to do with this player, productive, definitely fast, but wanted to hear what your thoughts are. And that's, a smaller guy out of Purdue, Rondell Moore, 42.5 vertical, right? So super explosive, 6.68 3 cone, 4.29 40, and he's known for his speed, but is that something that really shows up in his game? And what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, it's a tough thing because it didn't really show up in his game as consistently as you'd like to see, but he was also hurt a lot. I think he was playing with a lot of injuries. And then that makes you question, is this the type of guy, like you look at a guy like Sterling Sharp way back in the day, whose birthday I think is today, why I bring him up, who played on that toe injury where he could barely walk and he's still leading the league in receptions and playing at a high level. There are some other players who they get dinged like a Dante Stallworth, and it's like, forget it. They're not even playing for weeks. And I think that Rondell Moore is more like the latter version. Like, if he gets nicked, he's useless. That's what I'm worried might happen. I hope he proves me wrong there, because in terms of speed and quickness, when you watch him at the line of scrimmage, especially as a slot player, his releases are blindingly quick. He's just blindingly sudden. And then you have that after catch ability in terms of the contact balance and the maneuverability to flip the hips and just make people look silly and really just flip the field with your running skill. So is he the next Steve Smith? I hear that a lot. No, I just don't. That kind of offends my aesthetic about Steve Smith, but but he's not quite there, because I don't think he hasn't had enough targets to prove that he's a contested catch receiver at that level. Especially at the deep level, he has all the physical skills that show it, but nothing on tape that proves it with enough exposures. So to me, if you're going to be conservative about what he is, he's what people hoped Tavon Austin would be, which is a guy who could be a gadget player, but a lot more, because you can put him in the slot and run true slot routes, and occasionally put him outside, and he can track the ball, as long as he's, the contested part we just don't know about yet. And maybe he will hit that Steve Smith neighborhood mark, but he's got a lot to show for me to do that before that happens. You're not gonna award someone a PhD because you think they're smart. They have to do the work to prove it, and he hasn't done that yet.
Folks, if you're looking for any other reasons to pick up the RSP, it's only $21.95, a screaming value in today's society. Matt also donates 10% of sales to a great charity called Darkness to Light. They raise awareness of the prevalence of and consequences of child sex abuse. So, Matt, great cause there. Any thoughts or any words you want to say about the charity?
Sure. It's a great organization. This is obviously always a tough thing to talk about for people. There's still a lot of stigma and taboo associated with it, and a lot of shame. But 1 out of 4 children have been sexually abused in their lifetime, and it has been a major problem for many years. And it's one of those things that we often screw up how to handle it. Sometimes the biggest drama that comes for kids is not that they got abused, as weird as that sounds, but it's how families or authorities handle it, because not being believed is oftentimes the biggest source of the trauma. So, this is an organization that's dedicated to, preventing it as well as helping people address it when it happens so that they address it appropriately so that it doesn't exacerbate the trauma or compound the trauma that the children have been subjected to. And so it's a great organization. I know this sounds sad that I can't remember the gymnast from Michigan State the Olympic gymnast, but she's, who was abused by her coach, but, she's a face of this organization as well. She's partnered with them. This month is Child Abuse, Sexual Abuse Prevention Month in April. And the RSP's already donated $4,000 as of yesterday to the cause once again. And I've capped it at $5,000 at this point, and do 10% of every sale until I get to that mark. But figured that, this was it was easy to be able to do that. And we'll probably get to that 5,000 mark again, fairly soon and donate the rest. But this is an organization been given to since 2011. And so, yeah, it's not always a comfortable thing to talk about. And when I tweet about what it is, you're not going to get a lot of likes or a lot of retweets about it because it's a weird topic. But the people who get it understand and appreciate it. And I know people appreciate it, even if it's not an easy thing to be, be talking about. But yeah, it's a great organization. Charity Navigator, you can look at them, and they have scored a 100 out of 100 in terms of how they manage, distribute, and deal with their financials.
Well, let's shift gears here. And if we wouldn't be doing a draft show, let's be honest, if we didn't mention someone from Dwayne's beloved Mean Green of North Texas. So they have a wide receiver, I believe it's Jaylon Darden. This is a kid who seems like he's getting better every year. And I'll be completely honest here. A friend of the show is dying for this info here, Matt. So we have to get your take on him. So Darden's a kid. It looks like he's got a great love for the game, knows how to leverage his strengths really well. How would you process his current deficiencies with things that he should be able to improve with good NFL coaching versus, potential negations of his overall ceiling?
Yeah, I mean, I think for him, he's going to have to develop plans on the outside in terms of defenders who want to pin him to the boundary because he's small. He's like Devonta Smith, small. Mm-hmm. So when you look at it from that perspective, the concern is, well, he can get physically dominated and taken out of the play. So what he'll have to learn to do is run routes that begin inside and then work its way back outside. He certainly has the acceleration and speed to do it. So there's really no excuse for him not to be able to develop this. And I think it should be fairly easy. The area where that could be a little bit more difficult for him is that he's a good contested catch passer when the defender's at his back and hits him, or when he's in kind of a bang situation where he knows that the defender's in his face and he's going to have to take a hit to the chest. He can do that. He's got enough toughness there. But when he sees contact coming fast out of the corner, out of the periphery, and he's tracking passes, he can kind of lose concentration there. That might be a little harder for him to correct. So there's certain types of targets that might be a little more difficult for him to make those big time splash plays. But when you look at him overall, this is a guy that should be a good slot receiver in the NFL, maybe a dynamic one at that, who can give you a lot against zone coverage, because he's his short area quickness is phenomenal, and he has absolute confidence in it to the point that he can let linebackers and safeties get within like a step of him, and then he's gone. It's just like a whiff of smoke that leaves a trail of smoke behind. And he does it on a regular basis. I think he joked to the media recently that, when he gets out of the bed in the morning, making someone miss is as much of a routine habit for him as brushing his teeth. And so you kind of like the confidence that he has. And I appreciate that of his game because you see it on the field. So I think he's a good prospect, and really a guy that has a chance to be more than just an occasional slot option. He might be able to play inside and outside for you and be a viable fantasy starter one day.
Folks, we've been talking with Matt Waldman, author of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. Head on over to mattwaldmanrsp.com and scoop up the 1,058-page RSP. Your dynasty teams will thank you. Trust me, as someone who has bought this for a number of years now. You know, it's like the hair club for men. It's like, I'm not just a hair club member or president, I'm also the client or whatever. But, hey, I use it. Dwayne uses it. Lots of our friends use it. And you're going to dominate your dynasty leagues. So, Matt, thanks for coming on our maiden voyage here with PFF. We couldn't have picked a better guest. And, man, just best of luck going forward here in 2021.
I appreciate it, and congratulations once again, guys. I wish you guys the best throughout the season. I'm sure we'll be talking again down the line. And if you're new to the RSP, I'll just add this. It sounds kind of foreboding to have that much information, but everything's bookmarked. It's easy to use. Most people are pleasantly shocked at how easy it is to navigate. And I'll just say that with that in the post draft that I do, which is much smaller and gives you actionable items, you'll think, I just want the post draft. And I get people who email me every year. They're like, count me among the converted that I can't wait for the RSP pre-draft because of the value that it holds long-term along with it. So you get both for $21.95 and you will be pleasantly shocked.
Anything else, Dwayne, before we get out of here?
No, man. Just thank you, Matt. Appreciate having you on. And it's like Drake said, couldn't have had anybody better on. Yes, we will get back together. And yes, absolutely, people, just buy it. And you'll definitely want the post draft. Like Matt, all the stuff we talked about scheme fits and all that kind of stuff, he hits on, he used the best word, Matt. It's just super actionable stuff. So love the work. Been reading it a long time. When you told me who Russell Wilson was before anybody else knew, like you had me hooked. Like nobody knew anything about Russell Wilson except for Matt Waldman. He said, draft this guy in your fantasy draft. People are like, who's Russell Wilson? Is he even in the league? Yes. This guy, Matt Waldman, told me about him.
Well, there you go. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And, you guys do great work. So I'm, obviously I'm big fans of both y'all, and I look forward to, seeing y'all's continued success for sure.
Cool. And if you want to give us a follow on Twitter, I'm at Drake Fantasy. He is at Dwayne McFarland, and our guest is at Matt Waldman. Thanks, everybody. Keep on checking in with us here. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, you name it. We're going to just spray paint it on the side of a highway somewhere. You can find out information about this show. It's so out of control right now. But for the guys, I am Brian Drake. Remember, folks, never get out hustled. We'll see you later. Take it easy.